O'Brien's gone back to Earth for a holiday with Keiko and presumably their daughter, though Sisko doesn't mention it, and that means it's up to everybody else to keep things running. Something's already broken down and Dax is researching it while ignoring Bashir's terrible attempts at flirting, but we'll assume that's just filler because the real story is arriving now. Some people are watching Dax through netting, with one saying her name. As she leaves, they move to follow. They catch up to her in a corridor, and after one calls to confirm they've got the right person, they grab hold of her. In a rare example of Bashir's tendency to ignore rejection being useful, he was trying to catch up with her as well and intervenes. A bit of wrestling ensues, and despite him getting the drop on one of them, another kicks the shit out of him and leaves him on the floor. The third keeps hold of Dax and removes her comm badge before they all drag her away while Bashir has a nap. He calls Ops when he wakes and tells them what happened, but doesn't know how long he's been under. Will lock down the station and try to find her, something made somewhat more difficult by the removal of her badge. It's not been long from the looks of things, as the trio are still dragging Dax down corridors, and they know enough about the station to avoid security systems. They can't avoid airlock cameras though, and Kira spots them. Well, I suppose they could have avoided them by teleporting instead of having this elaborate escape, but let's ignore that for now. Either way, Odo knows where they are now, so he nips down there to join his security teams while Kira sticks force fields around it all. It would appear our kidnappers know how to beat those force fields too, and get aboard a ship. Just as well that Sisko saw this coming and was able to get their tractor beam working again, a malfunction they'd assumed was random due to O'Brien being on his hollybobs, but was actually deliberate. The tractor beam brings the ship back to dock, so Odo can get aboard and make sure Dax is alright, and that's a bit of a good news, bad news situation really. Dax is physically fine, but you couldn't really say she's alright, not when these people are legally extraditing her for murder and treason. Odo's going over the warrant. It alleges that Dax was involved in the death of a certain general 30 years back. That would make it Curzon Dax rather than Jadzia, and that lines up with his history. 30 years ago, he was a Federation representative to officiate peace talks on the planet where the guy in question, undead. It also says Curzon betrayed the government of that world to rebels, who presumably still lost anyway if this shit is being chased up 30 years later. Sisko's the first to admit Curzon was a bit of an arse on occasion, but thinks murder is a bit much, even without the treason. And therein lies a problem, as Odo points out. Curzon wasn't the only entity inside the body, was he? Let's ask Dax herself, shall we? Well, we can ask, but that doesn't mean she'll answer. Dax stonewalls any questions Sisko has, refusing outright to accept any help. It's hard to hear, and Sisko asks if the friendship he had with Curzon didn't survive the process of moving to a new host. Jadzia's sorry, and still considers him a friend, but won't budge. The leader of the trio wants to be away with his prisoner. As the murdered general was his dad, I think it's time to assume he's important and stick a name on the lad. Kidnap Cop will now be known as... General Specific, offered by Commander Sam Vimes. Sisko listens to General Specific and then goes off on somewhat of a tangent. Dax may not want Sisko's help, but that doesn't mean he's just sat around on his arse, and he's been trying to figure out why General Specific went to the trouble of kidnapping when it was all perfectly legal. The answer is that the warrant works on the Federation. Deep Space Nine, however, is not a Federation base. It's Bajoran, and Bajor has no extradition treaty with General Specific's people. In fact, General Specific's lads are allied with the Cardigans, which is probably why they knew about how to bypass security, and that obviously makes both Kira and her government a wee bit pissed off. So much so that there'll need to be a hearing to decide what to do with Dax. Sisko's not sure where to hold the hearing, as it'll need to be a decently sized room. Odo's already considered this and blackmailed Quark into donating the use of his establishment, which is handy as that's the only big set Deep Space Nine currently has that isn't Corridor. With the immediate problem solved, Sisko wants Odo to pop over to General Specific's planet and start digging around. It's a 30-year-old case and from a period of significant civil unrest, but maybe Odo has the skills to turn something up while Sisko stalls for time. He's going to struggle with stalling. The judge appointed to the hearing makes it very clear that she has no intention of pissing away what remains of her life on pointless waffle. General Specific outlines the case and is almost immediately cut off by the judge, who says she's read the paperwork. What she wants to know is why it took 3 decades to get started. Being told the details were sealed in military files seems to satisfy her. Sisko's turn, and he argues that the warrant is fundamentally flawed. It refers only to DAX, but Curzon DAX, who they're saying committed the crimes, snuffed it a couple of years back. The person they're currently trying to pin it on wasn't even born when General Specific's dad did a dead. The judge isn't happy that things have taken this turn, but seems to accept that her nice, quick case is going to be anything but. Sisko sets Bashir and Kira on research duty. The former is tasked with finding medical evidence that new Trill hosts are separate entities, the latter with finding any examples of legal cases for intergenerational Trill. They go off to find what they can as Odo calls in to report his progress. Odd thing, though, everybody old enough to have been around at the time says Curzon and General Specific's dad were the best of mates, certainly not a situation where the former would be inclined to murderize the latter. He hangs up after telling Sisko he plans to speak to the widow, and we follow him there. She's very clear that this whole thing is complete bollocks and Curzon is innocent. She says her son, General Specific, wouldn't listen to her and instead pressed ahead with the case on his own, referring to him as obsessed. All she knows is that a transmission from persons unknown was sent to the enemy 30 years back, saying exactly where the murdered guy would be, and only 5 people knew that data. General Specific's eliminated all except DAX, or at least says he has. Before Odo leaves, the widow asks after Curzon to find out how he's doing, and is surprised to discover that he died 2 years prior. In fact, I'd go so far as to say she seemed very upset. General Specific's brought in another joined Trill as an expert witness. Through them, we establish that the symbiont carries memories of past hosts, and something more. The emotions of those former hosts, such as guilt of a crime, would remain too. Sisko interrupts to argue this isn't a trial, though I'd have probably pointed out that feelings and facts aren't the same thing. Regardless, it's his turn. We learn that a host isn't accepted until they're in their 20s to ensure there's full understanding of everything involved, but that's not the important part. The real kicker is that, once joined, host and symbiont become a single unit, as different to the individual parts as a cake is to its ingredients. And that makes Sisko argue that any memories from past hosts are no more the responsibility of Jadzia Dax than an implanted memory would be his. It's all getting a bit rowdy for the judge, so she calls a break to let things calm down. When they reconvene, it's Bashir's turn to give evidence. A half-joke from the judge to just pluck out the worm in Jadzia's gut is nixed by him, as it would kill them both. Instead, he goes on to explain the many and varied biological differences between Curzon and Jadzia, the most interesting of which is that their brain waves are different. Unfortunately, that gives General Specific an opening. See, the symbiont has its own brain, and while they work in tandem once joined, he argues the brain of the symbiont is the same as it was when it was joined to Curzon. Time for Sisko to take the chair, and he has Kira asking the questions. A brief description of his relationship with Curzon Dax paints a picture of someone not always on their best behaviour, essentially the stereotype of wine, women and song. But that description, unflattering as it is, has a purpose. It's nothing like Jadzia. The unflattering description is also tempered by Sisko's surety that Curzon had a core of ethics and would not commit the acts of which he's accused. It all devolves into the same argument Sisko and General Specific have already had around whether the Dax part of Jadzia makes her the same as Curzon. Once they run out of metaphors, the judge tells them there's going to be an hour's break before Jadzia herself will be asked to give evidence. Odo's got an update. As the murder happened because of a call sent to rebels, he decided to check call logs. He didn't find anything about that, but did find a lot of calls from Curzon to the guy's home. Normal if they were close friends, but not normal for them to be happening while the guy wasn't home, but his wife was. That's potentially very bad news indeed if the implication proves accurate, so it's time for another chat in person. He's uncovered some more details by the time he sees her, receipts for gifts and multiple breaks at a hotel, just far enough away to be accessible, yet clandestine. The widow has no desire to discuss it until Odo explains how bad this looks for Curzon and how it could affect Jadzia. This convinces her to reveal that the dead general, this man of legend, was the same as most legends, which is to say, entirely fictional. She doesn't go into detail about why, but it's clear the celebrated hero was nothing like the real man. The pressure of being a legend's widow left her with little choice but to keep her mouth shut and go along with the charade. Nobody wants to be told their heroes were mortal, especially by people who actually knew them. Much better, much easier, and much safer to let him stay a saint and have that shining halo blind anybody who looks too closely. But the widow's realised he'll be a hero to most no matter what happens now, and perhaps that gives her the freedom to be something other than the devoted widow. Sisko's pissed off at DAX. He's concluded she's staying quiet to defend the honour of the widow Curzon was doing sexy times with. Rather delightfully, he even wonders if General Specific is actually Curzon's son, an idea that hadn't occurred to me. Some points to the writers for including it. That's not the case, says Dax, and distracts him with a little history between them as a method of calming him down. Afterwards, she admits that Curzon was a dirty little bastard who did the naughties with a married woman. She also says it wasn't just some illicit fluid swapping, and she mattered to him a great deal. Enough, perhaps, for Jadzia to feel that keeping her mouth shut now is still the right thing to do. Back in the hearing, Sisko tries his best to paint Jadzia as a unique individual before she became a host, and details her many achievements on her own merit. General Specific simply asks if she understood that becoming a host would mean taking on the responsibilities of the previous hosts. It's a question to which we don't get an answer, as Odo's back and he's brought the widow. After introducing herself to the court and ignoring General Specific asking what his mum's doing here, she tells the judge that Curzon can't have been the person who betrayed her husband, and she knows that for a fact because when the call was made, she was with Curzon and testing how shock-resistant her bed was. The revelation looks like it's cost her the relationship with her son, but from his actions to date, maybe that's not entirely negative. As alibis go, it's a pretty good one. The judge calls proceedings to a close, leaving General Specific staring off into the middle distance, probably trying to dispel unwanted mental images. It's all over, bar the theme music, and that gives Jadzia and the widow a chance to catch up. Jadzia felt compelled to keep the secret Curzon made, but it goes a bit deeper than everybody else knew. He wasn't just defending the widow, but the dead general himself, as the call made to rebels was from him. He'd intended to betray his own side, a plan that ultimately backfired when the rebels murderized the shit out of him. Maybe they reasoned that an ally who'll sell you out at the first sign of trouble was an ally they'd rather not have. I can't fault the logic, even if it did result in them losing. The widow wishes Jadzia a good life before departing, and we leave Dax to perhaps contemplate what might have been, until the next adventure. We're left with a whole lot of questions at the end of this one, and I do so love a good thought experiment. How does the Trill justice system work, and do liabilities die with hosts? The question posed in this episode is whether joined Trill can commit murder and get away with it by moving host, but there are plenty more where that came from. How does changing host affect inheritance laws? Is it still technically death, or does the new host own everything from the old? If not, is it possible to list a new host in your will when that entity technically doesn't exist yet for legal purposes? And what measures are in place to prevent joined Trill from amassing wealth and power as a result? That feels like a recipe for dictators. Jadzia's told us that joined Trill tend to avoid romantic involvement, but what of those who choose to? Would a new host be liable for child support payments if the old host was a parent? What about pensions? Do they get the pension until the host dies, or the symbiont? Can a dying Trill take out a massive loan and piss it away on nose candy, leaving the new host free of those debts if the estate of the former host doesn't cover them? Could a joined Trill who's become disenfranchised by the whole thing commit multiple heinous crimes out of spite and ensure the next 10 hosts spend their lives in prison? Do joined Trill in prison even get a new host? That could make any incarceration a potential death sentence for the symbiont. The whole thing is a legal minefield, and utterly fascinating as a result. Like many interesting questions in Trek, it's a coin toss as to whether we actually get an answer. In this case, we don't, perhaps to deliberately avoid setting a precedent by which later episodes must abide before the show's given a real chance to get a feel for what it is. I know we explore some of this later on, but it's fun to theorise while we've still got the chance. As to the story itself, well, once you remove the trill bits, we're left with a pretty mundane murder mystery with a predictable enough outcome. But that was never meant to be the point of this one, only there to serve as a jumping-off point for the ethical considerations of living multiple lifetimes. I've already said I've got time for making the entertainment up in my own head, but I can absolutely see how people who went into this with different desires would be underwhelmed, especially by the ending. How much you enjoy this episode will probably depend on what you were looking for when you hit play. Before we stop, there's one last thing I'd like to consider, a throwaway line but one with potentially significant implications. During the opening chat between Bashir and Dax, she's looking at schematics for the station and says of a particular part, "The technology looks like something the Cardigans must have taken from the Romulans." Now that's interesting for two reasons. Firstly, it shows off the complexity of O'Brien's job on Deep Space Nine. If the Cardigans are running on tech pilfered from all over the shop, he's not just dealing with one set of engineering principles, but many. The second, and potentially more far-reaching reason, is that Dax recognizing the tech implies we're familiar with it as well. Romulans are naturally secretive and keep to themselves, so it's unlikely they traded the tech with us. There was some formal nastiness with them in the past, but that was a couple of 100 years prior, so it's not likely the source. That leaves picking over later wreckage, which is possible, or implies that the Federation's own espionage capabilities are far more significant than we let on. I'd be the first to admit that's a stretch, and I'll grant you I'm probably reading more into it than is there, but it does fit in rather neatly as potential foreshadowing, doesn't it? End of episode.
This is Space Dog to Deep Space Nine on board the Delta Fly, but I mean the dog floater? Oh Christ, I've made it sound like a turd now. Fuck it. Anyway, requesting permission to land, and also requesting that nobody asks why we didn't call earlier now that we've established it was always an option. Oh, and I've got no fingers, and I don't know how to land a shuttle, so, it's probably going to be a bit rough, just to let you know.
What do you mean you don't know how to land? You went through all those training videos.
Yeah, I'll be honest with you, mate. I wasn't really paying attention to them. Anywho, we're coming in. Get a landing pad ready. Or don't. I'm not that arsed.
We are too fast. Slow down.
Which part I don't know how to land did you not get?
We are going to crash.
Oh yeah, I forgot they had a tractor beam.
Weird. So did I. And it's something they could have used ages ago.
I'm sure there's a really good technical reason for not using it before, and not just because the guy who writes these forgot as well. Anyway, in we go. Woof.